both terms in the literature, is really focusing on the distributions of attitude, values, and the opinions in a society. And of course, the larger the distribution is on attitudes, values, and opinions, the larger the polarization. You can also consider it as the more extreme positions people do have on certain attitudes, on certain values, then the larger there is the polarization, right? This is what ideology-based, issue-based polarization is about. The other one is this affective identity-based polarization. And here we refer to the extent to which citizens identify with a certain group. It can be a political group, it can be a social group, but it's a group. And they identify with this group because of the political stances, because of the attitudes and so on, and they develop a very close in-group identity, which is okay. But identity-based polarization has, of course, something on the other side, has a different pole, and this is then the out-group that is important to be considered in this identity-based polarization, because the out-group is more or less the extent to which this group that is identifying with others in the group wants to distance itself from the other group and holds therefore stereotypes, negative views, and so on the other group. And the larger this distance is on the identification that me, the in-group, is good and the out-group is bad, the higher the polarization is. It could even be that the political stances of those two groups are identical, but as long as there is this affective notion that the other ones are the bad ones, we have this problem in terms of polarization. So affective polarization is higher the more citizens identify with their group, and the more likely and the higher they dislike members, supporters of the other groups. And this is very often also considered as social identity, which in the literature is said the part of individual's self-concept which derives from his knowledge of his membership of a social group together with the value and emotional significance attached to that membership. It has been written in 1978. I'm just mentioning that. That's the reason why you only see here his and not her in there. This has changed, of course, in terms of values over the years quite substantially. Texts are written differently nowadays. So why should we care all about that? I mean, yeah, we know that social cohesion perceptions are not good. We also have seen that polarization is something problematic, especially if there is something like identity-based polarization. Well, the problem with that is that the greater the political polarization with regards to identity-based polarization, but also to issue-based polarization, and the greater the disruptive effect on interpersonal trust, and here we already see how trust is important in terms of social cohesion amongst the people living in one society, the greater the impact on social cohesion, the negative impact on social cohesion. Now let's have a look on this affective polarization in Austria with regards to the vaccination. I mean, that was the topic that really was kind of, doing the news, making political actors, doing lots of policies and so on over the last 2 years and still to a certain extent today. And let's see what actually we can see in terms of polarization, identity-based polarization in Austria in that regard. And I will present some data from the ACPP that two colleagues of us have published on. These are Markus Wagner and Jakob Moritz Ebel, who have asked in the ACPP about vaccination identities. And this is different from the vaccination status, even though I can tell you immediately that the results are identical if you take vaccination status into account. But here it's really about vaccination identity. So we asked them, to which group do you belong to, you feel close to, the ones that got vaccinated, the ones that did not get vaccinated, or a neutral position. And the numbers look like that altogether 17% of our sample said they feel close to the anti-vaccination group, 18% said they are neutral, and the large majority, 65%, said they are having a pro-vaccination identity. The next thing that we did, we asked them, how do you evaluate the other group, and how do you evaluate your own group. And we use there these stereotypical attributes like you see here: intelligent, honest, selfish, unpatriotic. And I can tell you from this table here that the people, they always consider the in-group members more intelligent, more honest, more unselfish, more unpatriotic, and so on and so forth. So what we really see here is, and this is amazing, we did not expect, and especially Markus and Jakob Moritz, did not expect to find such strong identities on vaccination in Austria, because normally the effects are rather small, but they found really, really strong effects on those identities, that those who identify with a certain group see the outgroup in a very negative manner, both ways. And only the ones, if you look into the last column here, those who say actually they do not identify neither with the in-group nor the outgroup are pretty stable, are pretty neutral in the sense that they are not considering any of the groups more intelligent or more patriotic, and so on and so forth. However, please remember what I said before: the neutral group is 18%, right? So it's a very small group, and then the other two groups, well, the anti-vaccination group is a very small group as well, whereas the pro-vaccination group is a very large one here. But you can already see there is something like an identity-based polarization going on. And the two came to the conclusion that high levels of in-group identification and out-group stereotyping within both the pro-vaccination group as well as the anti-vaccination group can be observed. So we have some issues here in the sense that we have a kind of polarization in terms of vaccination, where the own group is considered in a very favorable manner, and there is some denigration with regards to the out group. And of course, we have heard yesterday also that this might be something that might vanish over a long term, which we probably do hope that vanish over a long-term period, but we see here very strongly enshrined affective polarization issues with regards to vaccination. In this definition of what actually polarization can do on social cohesion, there was also the word trust, in the sense of saying, okay, this can have an impact on interpersonal trust, but of course it can also have impact on trust in institutional trust. And if there is very little institutional trust, then we do have, and we know that from the literature, but also from empirical studies, that then we do have problems in terms of legitimacy and support for the political system as such. So therefore, let's see how these trust levels, how these legitimacy levels changed over the pandemic. Here I have a graph on trust in government where Austria is compared with other countries. And this study has been done by the Eurofund and has been done in spring 2020, in summer 2020, and then again in spring 2021. And here, there is Austria, right? So the Austrian government had a lot of trust, or could gain a lot of trust by the Austrian population in the beginning of the pandemic. And this is also something that we see in our data. I will show you then later on data from the ACPP, but lost this trust dramatically over time. And here in spring 2021, it's really almost at the end of this graph. And I will show you in a minute another graph. We know that this value has decreased even more, that the trust in the government is even lower. But here you already see that there is something really dramatic going on within a very, very short time period, also regarding the potential impact with regards to how society is considered, how social cohesion is perceived. So this is now the data that Bernhard was already referring to yesterday a little bit about the different institutions in Austria and the trust that citizens do have towards those institutions in Austria. This line here is the government, right? This is beginning of June. So it stops here in June 2022. It's the lowest line. The other one here, this is the parliament, right? Also the parliament, the other legitimized political institution in Austria, has dropped substantially in the trust of people. And there is one thing that I would like to point out, because this is really very, very strange for an Austrian society. The trust in the Austrian parliament and the trust in the Austrian government is lower than the trust in the European Union. That has never happened before. And you see here the European Union never experienced a lot of trust. And this is something that we actually can see since the 1990s. However, the situation on the pandemic created such an environment that even the national institutions are below the trust in the European Union, where the European Union stayed very stable, was not really taken into consideration with negative values over the pandemic. And here it's also what has been mentioned yesterday by Bernhard, the ORF, the public broadcaster, started out with high levels of trust and then went down over the course. Sorry, I'm here with the red one. Went down substantially. So again, people do not trust those old institutional setups, organizational setups of the political system any longer, and the drop is rather substantial. And as I said before, trust, if you lose trust in core institutions of a liberal democracy, this means losing legitimacy, this means losing support, this means also losing the possibility to do something for the society, and the society actually also taking it in, because you simply don't trust the lawmakers, the policymakers any longer, and therefore combined with what we saw on the first slide, that the perception of a decreasing social cohesion is of course problematic, because who should tackle also then this decreasing social, social cohesion as we saw it. This is something that makes me even more worrisome. So you see, Bernhard and myself, we did good cop, bad cop. He's saying it's not too bad. Me saying, I'm not too happy what I see here, because these are the worst numbers that we saw, that we actually see in the Second Republic in Austria, the unsatisfaction with the way democracy works in Austria. There was always some kind of not being satisfied with the way democracy works in Austria, but these were always down here, like we see them in wave 1 and 2, which was March and April of 2022. We saw these few people, these 5% up to 8% in Austria that were unsatisfied with the way democracy works over the last 20, 30, 40 years, since we have had data, empirical data, but we never saw numbers like that, that 1/3, even more than 1/3 of the Austrian population is unsatisfied with how the way how democracy works in Europe. And this is, of course, something that makes you worrisome, because also that believing in the democracy, or believing in the way how democracy works, is again a very important tool to somehow also deal with social cohesion, also to provide the perception to the people that this country is still providing social cohesion to the people living in there. Okay, what to do? I can't give you answers. I immediately tell you I've prepared my working group in such a way that my students provide the answers, so therefore already do some thinking about that. Also because my colleagues come to this conclusion, which is not very positive. In a sense, outward animosity on both sides, and we see polarization now on vaccination, on certain policies, but we also see this polarization on institutional aspects when it comes, for example, to democracy satisfaction. So these animosities on both sides will make it even more difficult to foster public deliberation and to seek diverse perspectives concerning complex topics. And you will probably agree with me that we have a lot of complex topics, and we have a lot of complex topics that have reached our agenda since the outbreak of the corona pandemic. I just would like to mention inflation, the war in Ukraine, and so on and so forth. there is something that makes me also more worrisome, and this is something called sorting. Sorting is a very theoretical term, but this term means nothing else than the extent to which divisions on different issues or characteristics cumulate or cross-cut to other issues as well. So this means that how, for example, the divisions that we see on democracy, the divisions that we see on vaccination, can also be the same divisions on other issues like the Ukraine crisis or, for example, the war in Ukraine or the inflation. And this is exactly what we also did in ACPP, which was published about 2 weeks ago in the Profil, where we took the divisions that we know exist with regards to vaccination in Austria and saw how these vaccination identities are somehow connected to how the war in Ukraine is perceived. And you see here that those being vaccinated say that the country responsible for the war in Ukraine is Russia, and those not being vaccinated also to a kind of large extent say the responsible country is Russia, but then you see here completely opposite tendencies, that they say it's Ukraine, it's the European Union, and even more so, it's saying it's the United States. So we see here that based on the vaccination, also other sorting is going on with regards to the other crisis situations we have, like Ukraine or the inflation. And this is this is what my colleague Jakob Ebel tried to do even further, saying, okay, how is that connected with certain political factors? And he sees here that most of the people saying that other countries than Russia are responsible for the war in Ukraine are mainly voting for the Freedom Party and are also mainly voting or tend to vote, because they have not yet been able to present themselves in a national election, for the newly created anti-vaccination party, MFG. And there is something that I think it's important to know, because it fits very nicely into what tomorrow Nicolas Forgo is going to do in his presentation and workshop on fake news, that we also need to consider in this whole debate the media. Because what we see here is that those using, consuming, in whatever way, Telegram are much more likely to assigning the responsibility to another country than Russia with regards to the war in the Ukraine. So you see, we do have these identity-based polarizations on vaccination in Austria. We see that these identity-based polarization on that issue travel to other issues, to other crisis situations that we have at the moment. And that is definitely something that is worrisome, even though they might only be 10 to 15% of the population, at least to our data. So I would like to conclude pluralism and social cohesion. I'm an optimist, and therefore I say, yes, it's possible, but it's a matter of weakening social identities, the social identities that we have somehow created over the last 2.5 years in a strong way that were not foreseeable before. And definitely, and this is probably something that we need to do much more, and it's also a question of more strongly legitimized political institutions. And in that respect, I also would like to follow up and end with what Bernhard yesterday said. These people that are sorted on vaccination, on the Ukraine war, on inflation, and so on and so forth, these are the loud, the noisy, the aggressive ones. But they're still the minority. And I think it's up to us to somehow say it's the majority that is still ruling, and the majority that is actually legitimizing those political institutions in making the checks and balances that we have implemented in liberal democracy work. And this is something that I would like you to take home as a home take message. Thank you very much.